Hello, this is Sandy again, and today we're going to be discussing the Civil Rights Movement from 1954 to 1968. But before we begin, I'd like to say there are many different ways to look at history, and there's no single history that is totally complete and accurate. One kind of history is a Marxist history, which suggests that all of history is a struggle between classes, that all of history is just nothing but a continual conflict between rich and poor. There's much to be said for that. I think it's an incomplete view of history, but that's a very powerful tool for historians to interpret the past. Another way of looking at the past, more recently, has been suggested by many feminist scholars who suggest that all of history, all of the history of humankind, is this story of man's oppression of women. And I think, again, that's a very valid perspective on history. Many feminist historians today have a more nuanced view of history and think of history, the history of women, as having ups and downs, and is much more complicated than just a simple paradigm of the oppression of women. But again, I think a very valuable instrument of historians to interpret history. Another way of looking at history is the way I discussed in previous videos, as a continual conflict or balance between rural and urban areas. And I think that's a very valuable way of thinking about history. But I think perhaps one of the most powerful ways to think of American history is the influence of race on all of American history, from the beginning, from the American Revolution, the Civil War, up to the present day. I think you cannot understand American history without understanding the role that race and slavery and segregation has played throughout all of American history. That being said, let's dive in. This will be the first in, I believe, a series of videos on the Civil Rights Movement. The first will look at the individuals who have been actively involved in the Civil Rights Movement, many of whom are not famous. I mean, we all know about Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, but there were many hundreds, thousands of individuals who risked losing their jobs, who risked losing their lives in the Civil Rights Movement. Many of them joined organizations that were independent of the famous civil rights leaders, independent organizations that were uncoordinated, but each of them had their own specific philosophy and their tactics that they used in the Civil Rights Movement. So in subsequent videos, we will look at the leaders. We'll look particularly at Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. But first of all, why did the Civil Rights Movement begin in 1954? Well, that's perhaps a little bit of an arbitrary date, but I think it's a valid one. But I think it's important to point out that this was a period, a post-World War II period of rising expectations, of general prosperity. The baby boomers, my generation, were in their teenage years and their early 20s, and were much different from their parents who lived through the Eisenhower years, the years I think of as years of conformity, where everybody was just happy to return to what they imagined as a traditional way of life that existed before the Great Depression, before World War II. So in the early 50s and throughout the 1960s, this baby boomer generation really made themselves known through their actions and helped to shape the course of events. I think it should be said as well that this was a period of time in which televisions became a major force in American society. News rapidly was transmitted by famous journalists like Walter Cronkite and Edward R. Murrow, which helped to shape, not just help to record and report, but helped to shape the events of the Civil Rights Movement. So, 1954. We usually say that the Civil Rights Movement started with the decision of the Supreme Court in Brown versus the Board of Education. This was a decision that nullified the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. We discussed that earlier from 1896, which said that separate facilities, in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, it was in reference to streetcars, separate facilities, as long as they were equal for blacks and for whites, was legally all right. The phrase that came about was separate but equal. But the Brown versus Board of Education decision, looking specifically at education and public schools, said that this was a myth. There could be no such thing as separate but equal. If you had separate facilities, obviously one was going to be better than the other, and white facilities were much better than black facilities for education. Whites got the best schools that were paid for in part by African American taxes. Whites got the best books in their schools, the best everything. They had the best buses that would take them past black neighborhoods to bring them to schools. So the Brown versus Board of Education decision radically changed education and ideas about education in 1954. Now, many people in the South did not take kindly to the Brown versus Board of Education decision and protested and brought a campaign of massive resistance to bear against desegregation. Many school systems closed their public schools. I know of localities that opened up private academies that were paid for in part by public taxes to avoid segregating or desegregating the schools. The Civil Rights Movement, beginning with Brown versus Board of Education, went through a series of phases. Usually when historians talk about revolutions, they describe three periods. There's a moderate period where people moderately suggest changes, gradual changes, but movements, if they become popular, oftentimes become radicalized. And the Civil Rights Movement rapidly changed from a moderate movement in Brown versus Board of Education to an increasingly radicalized movement. And we'll see this radicalization occur throughout the 1950s into the 1960s. And then finally, a reactionary phase when the powers of tradition and reaction, conservative forces come to bear and try to suppress all the gains of the movement. So by 1954, the stage was set. Violence occurred almost immediately in 1954, 1955, and continued throughout the period. Most famously, the story of Emmett Till. Should be noted. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old African-American boy who came from Chicago down to Money, Mississippi, where an event occurred. We're not exactly sure what it was, but it occurred in a grocery store where a white woman came in and Emmett Till either whistled or said, "Hey, how you doing?" Something that was deemed offensive by the white woman. She told her husband, who that evening went with a friend, dragged Emmett Till out of bed, and murdered him. Violence occurred again when James Meredith was granted admission to the University of Mississippi in 1962. Riots broke out. This was not uncommon. Riots broke out in which 2 people died. At that time, John F. Kennedy sent the army in to quell the riot. But this was the beginning of massive resistance and violence by whites in the South who wanted things to remain the way they imagined it always was, that they did not want their traditions or their culture, which was based upon race and violence, they did not want that to change, and acted out their concerns. The following year, 1955, was marked by the Montgomery Bus Boycott. It started when a seamstress named Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat in the front of a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. She was arrested for this, and many of her friends saw this as an opportunity to register their protest. A woman named Joanne Robinson spent all night putting together a mimeograph sheet of instructions or advice requesting people to boycott all the bus system in Montgomery for one day. Well, one day stretched on to 2, stretched on to 3, and went on for over a year as African Americans refused to ride buses, and which crippled the economy, particularly the department stores, as Christmas was coming in 1955. And finally, the Interstate Commerce Commission stepped in and declared that segregation in buses and public transportation was illegal, and this was affirmed shortly thereafter by the Supreme Court. This was a notable event for 2 reasons. One was a young Baptist minister named Martin Luther King emerged as a leader in the Montgomery Bus Boycott, offering sermons, offering speeches every night to packed audiences in the churches, advocating continued resistance and continued boycotting of the buses. This is the first step in his career in the civil rights movement. Also, very importantly, I think this was the first great success of a popular protest movement. I think that there had been actually many attempts at boycotts, many attempts at protests of various sorts, but this one, I think in large part because of the role of television, became very influential in subsequent events. The next major event in the civil rights movement happened in 1960 with the Greensboro SitIn movement. In that year, 4 students from the North Carolina Agricultural and Technical College went to a luncheon counter at the Woolworth 5 and Dime store and sat down and ordered a cup of coffee, and were promptly told, we don't serve, I can guess you can imagine the N-word, we don't serve blacks here. They decided to stay, and they stayed all that day until the place closed. The next day, more students came and joined them, and before long, this gained national attention, and sit-ins occurred not just in Woolworths, but in stores throughout the United States. Luncheon counters, it spread from luncheon counters in 5 and Dimes to churches where there were pray-ins, and swimming pools where there were wade-ins and swim-ins, and movie theaters where there were watch-ins. So the sit-in movement spread, I think ultimately, again, generating this popular mass of people who were determined that increasingly that they were not going to take the oppression of racial inequality and segregation anymore, and acted as individuals, oftentimes with very little organization, to further the goals of racial justice in the United States. One of the most dramatic events or series of events occurred in 1961 when several groups, particularly CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, CORE sponsored a series of freedom rides throughout the South. Now what this meant was they organized buses that would travel from Washington, D.C., south into through the Carolinas, Georgia, Alabama, through the heart of Old Dixie, through the heart of the Solid South, with passengers, black passengers, white passengers, who sat indiscriminately with whites in the back, blacks in the front. When they stopped at a bus stop, they get out and they go to the whites or the blacks' bathrooms without paying attention to which was which. Whites would drink at the colored drinking fountains. Blacks would drink at the white drinking fountains. They'd all sit down together at the lunch counter at the bus stops, and just challenging in this very dramatic way all of the segregation laws in the South. Well, 400 people or more participated in these rides. There were about 60 of them, and some of them met with extreme violence in Anniston, Alabama, in Birmingham, Montgomery, Alabama. They were met by crowds of white men, sometimes with lead pipes and baseball bats and chains, who attacked the riders. In Anniston, Alabama, a bus was firebombed, and as the passengers got off the bus, they were further attacked. In all of these instances, the police were miraculously invisible. I think oftentimes by previous agreement, the police decided that they would give the white mob free license for 15 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour before they would step in, and then oftentimes just to arrest the freedom riders. This was a very dangerous occupation, which ultimately led, again, the Interstate Commerce Commission to step in and say that segregation laws in busing was unconstitutional and illegal. In 1963, Martin Luther King organized what became known as the Birmingham Campaign. This was an attempt to attack all forms of racial segregation in voting, in jobs, throughout, in public accommodations, throughout all of Birmingham. And it went on for months and months. The goal at first was just to fill the jails with protesters who would not pay bail, but would fill up the jails until finally there was some kind of crisis that would be met, and hopefully the federal government or some kind of resolution would be accomplished. Well, it did not go well at first. King and his associates filled the jails, but there was still room left, and somebody made the decision. I don't think King was originally in favor of it, but ultimately went along with it, to call out school children to protest in the streets. The March on Washington was one of the high points of the civil rights era. After this, John F. Kennedy died, Lyndon Johnson came into office, and this was actually an opportunity, as Lyndon Johnson saw it, after Kennedy's death, to pass some of the programs from the progressive era, the New Deal era, that were still on the back burner of the liberal agenda. So Lyndon Johnson put together what he called his Great Society program, which included a war on poverty and which led to the creation of Medicare and Medicaid. But more importantly for our purposes, those are very important obviously, but more importantly for our purposes, he was able to work with Martin Luther King and with other leaders of the civil rights movement in putting together a package of proposals, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and later the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which transformed not just American society but the role of government in American society. The Civil Rights Act nullified state laws on segregation, declared it was within the powers of the federal government to ensure that integration of public facilities, entertainment facilities, hospitals, schools, was the law of the land. This was a massive expansion of federal powers, as many people in the South particularly were opposed to these actions and advocated for states' rights, which would become a calling card of conservatives ever since. The following year, 1965, Lyndon Johnson passed the Voting Rights Act, which nullified all the voting restrictions, the disfranchisement that we talked about during the Gilded Age, removed African American voters from the voting rolls. The poll tax, the literacy test, the grandfather clause, the whites only primary, these were all now illegal according to federal law. A couple of things should be noted about this. One is that voter suppression is still very much with us. Particularly recently, conservatives have implemented in state legislatures voter ID requirements that voters have IDs identifying themselves when they vote. Oftentimes they've been moving polling places. They've been limiting the number of hours and places where people could vote, particularly targeting African American voters to be removed from the voter rolls. So the battle against voter suppression, the battle against disfranchisement continues. But the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was a major step forward. Also, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 should be noted as important because it ended de jure segregation. De jure, D-E space J-U-R-E, meaning segregation was approved, was allowed by law. We still have segregation today, but it's not de jure segregation. We have de facto segregation. So we still, oftentimes, African Americans and white Americans will group together in schools and in churches. So we still have, I think, a ways to go, a long ways to go in ending some of these endemic problems in American society. 1964 was the year of Mississippi Freedom Summer. A group of young African American and white students put together an organization called SNCC, S-N-C-C, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And they worked on voter registration in Mississippi. And the idea was that Mississippi was majority African American, but was dominated by the white Democratic establishment. So they trained workers to go to local areas throughout Mississippi to teach people how to register to vote, how to answer the questions on the literacy tests and answer questions at the polling places. They met with intense resistance in Mississippi, and in one famous incident, 3 workers, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, Michael Schwerner, were murdered. They were apparently at a church, left early in the afternoon to get back to their home base, and were detained by a sheriff who arrested them for not having proper plates on their car, and then waited until after dark to release them when a group of cars driven by Ku Klux Klan members tracked them down and murdered them. This was actually part of a cynical plan on the part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They figured that if they could get white students, particularly from some of the better schools in the North, to come down and work in Mississippi, inevitably there would be violence. And that violence would attract national attention. And the tactic worked. It gained a lot of attention. The Mississippi Freedom Summer ultimately put together a group called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which tried to get seated at the Democratic National Convention in 1964. Failed, but throughout this process, number one, brought attention to issues in the South, but also, I think, radicalized many members of SNCC. So the title of the organization, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, by the end of the summer, I think many of the students who were involved in the movement had given up on the nonviolent part and became increasingly radicalized, increasingly anxious for immediate change in our social system. And we'll talk about where they went next and the fate of the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement that emerged from it in a later video. 1965 was probably the high point of the civil rights movement. The March on Washington the previous year was important, but in 1965, one of the final great protests occurred in Selma, Alabama, where people had organized to march from Selma to Montgomery. And their first attempt failed as police on horseback and with batons beat protesters as they marched over the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma on their way to Montgomery. John Lewis, Congressman John Lewis, was beaten actually several times. This was, I think, one of the first times, and suffered a concussion. But other people were hurt and bleeding as they finally were forced back across the bridge. There was a second attempt. We might talk about it later. The third attempt finally was a success. Martin Luther King came down. Leaders of all the major leaders of the civil rights movement, including a lot of Hollywood stars and entertainers, again, Peter, Paul, and Mary, Harry Belafonte, and others, Tony Bennett, you might not have heard of all these people, came down and celebrated this march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. Things went downhill fairly rapidly, actually was going downhill fairly rapidly throughout this period, but by the end of 1965, the movement was really hurting. I think Martin Luther King and others realized that the federal government, which they had worked with, Lyndon Johnson particularly, they had worked with, for the last several years, had really done all that he could do on the federal level. They had the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. What was the next step? For Martin Luther King, and again we'll talk about this more later, he just began to come to the conclusion that racism in the South was only part of a much larger problem, that poverty throughout the country, violence, particularly the war in Vietnam, these were all part of a single mess. That racism, poverty, violence were all part of a similar large problem in American society. And so he moved his campaign from the South to the North. He went to Chicago and worked on housing issues for poor people in Chicago. Later on in 1965, he turned against Lyndon Johnson's war in Vietnam. And I think this was a critical turning point for both Martin Luther King and for President Johnson. Martin Luther King got a lot of criticism for getting involved in political things that supposedly he should not have been involved in. He lost a lot of popular support among whites and African Americans. And Lyndon Johnson, on the other hand, I think began to see the light that his policies in Vietnam were not effective policies. I think we could use harsher language than that. Lyndon Johnson ultimately realized that he had screwed up and decided not to run for re-election in 1968. 1968 was a critical year in American history. By 1968, the movement was maybe on its last legs. Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1968, and the movement pretty much died thereafter. It wasn't just King's death, there were lots of other factors involved. Johnson's decision to leave the presidency, the war in Vietnam had taken on a new turn in 1968. Globally, there were protests on a whole host of issues in 1968. And then Richard Nixon was elected in 1968, a conservative Republican. I think you know by now something about his corruption and his involvement with the Watergate scandal and his ultimate impeachment, or not impeachment, but his ultimate removal from office. But his presidency marked a transition from the liberal period of the Civil Rights Movement to a much more conservative period, a reactionary period from 1968 onwards. So that's probably it for this video. Thank you for watching.